Hello, everybody. This is the final installment in my lecture video series on the philosophy of freedom for the Bay Area Waldorf teacher training. And in this video, I'll be covering chapters 12, 13, 14, and then in this book, there's a final section called Ultimate Questions, the Consequences of Monism, and then an appendix. So first off, chapter 12, moral imagination, and then in parentheses, Darwinism and morality. In this chapter, Steiner is continuing to elaborate on the claims that he makes in that culminating chapter, chapter 9, the idea of freedom. And specifically in this chapter, getting into the how of intuitively driven action, otherwise known as free action. So I had a good question in class, and it was one I pondered as well in prepping for it. What does it mean exactly to act on behalf of a purely conceptual intuition rather than to be motivated in action by a mental picture? And I think one of the reasons why this might be confusing is because it's something that we can only observe for ourselves. We can't observe somebody else in their experience of intuition. We experience the perceptible outcome of intuitively motivated action if we believe that it's possible, which we could only really come to a conviction of through our own self-observation, I think. But moral imagination is this phrase that Steiner uses to refer to how the intuitive action is then translated into the perceptible outcome of the event. And so, drawing on what he's already talked about when it comes to the pursuit of knowledge, where there is the individualization of concepts through mental pictures to the internalization of the perceptible world and the concepts that are bodied forth in it, in the form of memory pictures that represent, for instance, the universal concept of tree. I uniquely individualize through my experiences of trees out in the world. All of my experiences of trees are encompassed in my mental picture of treeness. And so when it comes to intuitive action, we're going the opposite direction, you could say, and there's this creative activity that's required of us to figure out how the general universal character of the concept or the intuition can be translated into the particular context of action. And so just to reiterate, as Steiner does at the beginning of this chapter, the free spirit is one who acts on behalf of purely spiritual intuitions, because according to Steiner, when this activity is online, so to speak, there's this repression of the psychophysical organization, which allows for this free spirit to determine their own activity rather than to be determined by their past. So Steiner writes, for the unfree spirit, the basis of action lies in the world of percepts given to him, that is, in his past experiences. He recalls, before coming to a decision, what someone else has done or recommended as suitable in a comparable case, or what God has commanded to be done in such a case, and so on, and he acts accordingly. So it could also be what the person has done in their past before. It could just be sort of mindlessly repeating what one has already done. And so whether it's the outer world of percepts that's determining the action, or the inner world of our inner percept, which, remember, is composed of all the memory pictures that we've internalized from experience, whether it's the inner or outer percepts, the action is unfree. Free action always arises out of the conscious, wakeful agent's intuitive negotiation of a very particular situation. And moral imagination relates to how that intuition comes to manifestation in the perceptible context. So whereas the free spirit determines their own motive in that moment, the unfree spirit acts according to motives that are baked into the percepts of the past, or the external imposition in the present. Steiner gives examples apart from instruction, what others have done or told one to do. There's also laws in the negative form, thou shalt not do this, and Steiner says one acts according to the motive of avoiding punishment when it's not something that is recognized, when the forbearance to steal, for example, is not recognized by the free spirit as something not worth doing. The unfree person refrains from stealing for fear of punishment, so the motivation is to avoid punishment that the law implies. For positive action, Steiner notes that there has to be specific instruction, and this is connected with what he refers to as moral imagination. So, for instance, we could translate one moral intuition or ideal into the phrase, love thy neighbor. But this could manifest in so many different particular contexts. And so the free spirit, if in a given instance they are inspired or they intuit that love thy neighbor is the appropriate moral ideal to enact in that moment, they have to creatively negotiate the perceptible context in order to realize that ideal intuition. For instance, it could look like clean the street in front of your door. Because to love thy neighbor also means to keep others in consideration when it comes to your space and how you keep it. So as Steiner writes, whenever the impulse for an action is present in a general conceptual form, then for each particular case, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, the concrete mental picture of the action, the relation of the concept to a content of perception, must be found. For the free spirit who is impelled neither by an example nor by fear of punishment or the like, this translation of the concept into a mental picture is always necessary. Then he goes on, man produces concrete mental pictures from the sum of his ideas chiefly by means of the imagination. Hence this notion, moral imagination. And on the next page he goes on to say, moral imagination, in order to realize its mental picture, must set to work in a definite sphere of percepts, a definite context, a historical, cultural context. Human action does not create percepts, but transforms already existing percepts and gives them a new form. So this not only includes the material world, but also the percepts of existing cultural institutions, existing laws, existing customs, existing habits of behavior. In order to be able to transform a definite object of perception or a sum of such objects in accordance with the moral mental picture, one must have grasped the principle at work within the percept picture, that is, the way it has hitherto worked, which one wants to give a new form or a new direction. Further, it is necessary to discover the procedure by which it is possible to change the given principle into a new one. Moral action, he says a bit further, then presupposes, in addition to the faculty of having moral ideas or moral intuition and moral imagination, the ability to transform the world of percepts without violating the natural laws by which these are connected. This ability is moral technique. What Steiner is saying here when he brings this additional notion of moral technique is that in order to be really effective with one's translation of an intuition into moral imagination, one needs to be very sensitive to the context. So one example we could work with is just the ongoing transformation in gender norms, or the norms between the sexes and the whole continuum between them. These changes are brought about for various reasons, including technological changes that transformed the ways of traditional life, and there's good things and bad things about that. But if we apply what Steiner is saying here to the scenario of cultural reorientation around gender norms, we could say that when he says, in order to be able to transform a definite object of perception or a sum of objects in accordance with the moral mental picture, one must have grasped the principle at work within the percept picture, that is, the way it has hitherto worked, which one wants to give a new form or a new direction. With the example of gender norms, we could say one would need to have a good working knowledge in that particular culture and historical moment of the customs of the past that have led up to the present conditions of men doing certain things and women doing certain things and people dressing in certain ways and relating to each other in different ways, and to examine, for instance, the emergence of birth control as a technology that has shifted things around quite a bit, and embracing the transformation in the gender relations, figure out how to best midwife them into being in a way that doesn't create this sharp discontinuity with the past that maybe confuses or upsets older generations, but yet also honors what is coming in with the new generations. This is just one example of how what Steiner's talking about can manifest in a concrete way. So then Steiner gets into why it is, and he's already touched upon this in a former chapter, but why it is that ethics can't become a science. So as he says, moral imagination and the faculty of having moral ideas can become objects of knowledge only after they have been produced by the individual. By then, however, they no longer regulate life, for they have already regulated it. They must now be regarded as effective causes, like all others. They are purposes only for the subject. We therefore deal with them as with the natural history of moral ideas. The reason for this is that, unlike other creatures, human beings, as creatures that are both embodied perceivers, like our animal kin, and yet also as beings that can think and so individually participate in the universality of ideas, and midwife spiritual intuitions into being and transform the existing world, rather than just continue on in the chain of determined causation. The individualizing effect of this wakeful participation in thinking, always reflecting context, means that there's this element of non-repeatability and irreducible difference. So as Steiner will say, I am an individual and have laws of my very own in that vein. Whereas the functioning of the organism occurs without any action on our part. We come upon its laws in the world ready-made and can therefore seek them and apply them when found. So that's Steiner speaking about the biological aspect of our being. But as wakeful creatures participating in thinking, there's something in addition to that we're dealing with here. So he says, moral laws, on the other hand, are first created by us out of our given context and out of our individual intuitive negotiation of a given context. The error arises, as he continues, through the fact that, as regards their content, moral laws are not newly created at every moment, but are inherited. Those that we have taken over from our ancestors appear to be given, like the natural laws of an organism, but a later generation will certainly not be justified in applying them as if they were dietetic rules. So dietetic refers to this way of thinking where there's an approach to ethics as if it could be a science based on the laws of the organism. For they apply to individuals, and not as natural laws do, to specimens of a general type. Considered as an organism, I am such a generic specimen, and I shall live in accordance with nature if I apply the natural laws of my general type to my particular case. As a moral being, I am an individual and have laws of my very own. What is best for me to do in a given context may not be what's best for you to do in a given context. Steiner then goes on to hold the pole of doubt and acknowledge that this may seem to be inconsistent with the theory of natural evolution, in that you can't claim that the future moral imagination is obviously a necessary outcome of the prior development, because then it would not be emerging from the free intuitions of irreducibly individual spirits, freely mediating intuitions in their given context. And Steiner makes this comparison to natural evolution to the extent that, yes, we can look back at what seems to be the evolutionary trajectory of life forms on Earth and see a logical connection between the proto-ammonites and the reptiles that we know to have emerged later on. But you can't produce the idea of reptiles out of pro-ammonites. If you didn't know that reptiles existed later on by virtue of ourselves existing later on in that process, if there was no notion of reptiles, you couldn't produce it out of the pro-ammonites. And the same is true for the moral imagination of a future culture as compared to a former culture. So as Steiner writes, no evolutionist should ever dream of maintaining that he could get the concept of the reptile with all its characteristics out of his concept of the proto-amniotic animal. Maybe I was mispronouncing that earlier. If he had never seen a reptile. If the evolutionist is to think consistently, he is bound to maintain that later phases of evolution do actually result from earlier ones, and that once we have been given the concept of the imperfect and that of the perfect, we can see the connection, but on no account should he agree that the concept attained from the earlier is, in itself, sufficient for evolving the later out of it. From this it follows for ethics that, though we can certainly see the connection between later moral concepts and earlier, We cannot get even a single new moral idea out of the earlier ones. So, for instance, the way that we think about gender dynamics today, even though we can see the historical connection looking backwards, we can't claim that it's a logical outcome of the past because it emerged through individual human beings negotiating their particular context. And I think this is really important because oftentimes you hear appeals when it comes to present gender dynamics to a kind of natural law, and that we've deviated from that somehow. And yet, there can also be ways in which new developments are so disconnected from what's come before that they may not even fully reflect reality itself, or that they may create conflict between generations. Whereas if one were to usher in the new through what Steiner calls moral technique, there might be more peaceful transition between different phases of intergenerational transformation. But to come back to the general picture of things here, Steiner says, in the process of evolution of the moral world order, we accomplish something that, at a lower level, is accomplished by nature. We alter something perceptible. We change what has been given. The ethical standard thus cannot start, like a law of nature, by being known, but only by being created, intuited in that particular moment. Only when it is there can it become an object of knowledge. So what Steiner suggests here, and then goes on to elaborate a bit, is that in the human, as this creature that is wakefully related to the world through thinking, but also as an embodied perceiver, nature is continuing its activity as the human, the waking creature, in the gradual evolution of the moral world order. As he writes, just as monism has no use for supernatural creative thoughts in explaining living organism, ethical individualism, then, he writes in this vein, is not in opposition to a rightly understood theory of evolution, but follows directly from it. He then goes on to wave away the possible importing of extra experiential explanations for the emergence of the moral world order as in metaphysical realism, and says, just as monism has no use for supernatural creative thoughts in explaining living organisms, so it is equally impossible for it to derive the moral world order from causes which do not lie within the experienceable world. It cannot admit that the moral nature of will is completely accounted for by being traced back to a continuous supernatural influence upon moral life, divine government of the world from the outside, for instance, or to an act of revelation at a particular moment in history, giving of the Ten Commandments, or to God's appearance on the earth as Christ. What happens to man and in man through all this becomes a moral element only when, in human experience, it becomes an individual's own. For monism, moral processes are products of the world like everything else that exists, and their causes must be sought in the world, that is, in man, since man is the bearer of morality. Ethical individualism, then, is the crowning feature of the edifice that Darwin and Haeckel have striven to build for natural science. It is spiritualized theory of evolution carried over into moral life. And so there he's referencing Ernest Haeckel, who was another evolutionary thinker, born after Darwin. The two were contemporaries, but Haeckel was younger. But I just want to back up a bit because there may have been a surprising moment for anyone who is familiar with Steiner's anthroposophical teachings when he says that this monistic perspective, this qualified monism that he's advocating, cannot admit that the moral nature of will is completely accounted for by being traced back to a continuous supernatural influence or to God's appearance on earth later on as Christ, because, as those familiar with anthroposophy will know, Christ is such a central reality in that worldview. But I think the key is here in the phrasing when he's referencing this monism and says it cannot admit that the moral nature of will is completely accounted for by being traced back to such and such. So it's not that he's saying that there is no relevance to these supposed events, to the moral nature of the will. It's just that if one were to point to those events as being the full explanation of moral will, then there would be no room for human freedom. And so he's qualifying that, not getting into that, but just saying that for the moral world order to unfold, even if there's this event, what Steiner later refers to as the turning point of time with cosmogonic significance, that enables the possibility for the free human spirit to transform the world eventually, it still requires the free human spirit to do so. He then says something that I really like, which is that this view where we recognize continuity between nature and human culture and the moral world order that human history and the process of civilization is bound up with, we have to expand our notion of the natural to include the free spirit. So he says the consistent evolutionist cannot fall a prey to such narrow-mindedness. He cannot let the natural course of evolution terminate with the ape and allow man to have a supernatural origin. In his very search for the natural progenitors of man, he is bound to seek spirit in nature. Again, he cannot stop short at the organic functions of man and take only these as natural, but must go on to regard the free moral life as the spiritual continuation of organic life. And once more, a kind of qualification of these claims in connection with those claims he would later go on to make in the Anthroposophical Register. It may be that the ongoing spiritual continuation of organic life and the enhancement of perception through various forms of spiritual exercise can lead to the actual observation of supposedly supernatural powers at work in the environs of Earth and even perhaps human history and cosmic history. I don't know. I'll let you form a judgment about that. This spiritualized view of evolution contrasts with any contemporary view of evolution which tries to derive what it means to be human out of what has come before the human. But instead, if we accord with Steiner's method, which is following upon Goethe's method, where we stay within our actual experience, we would have to include for this study, because we are speaking about the human being, we would have to include observation of all that goes into the possibility of freely motivated action. And as I mentioned from the outset of the summary of this chapter, this is something that we can only ultimately do for ourselves. We can't rely on an expert ultimately to prove to us that human freedom is a possibility, but only on our own experience of actualizing it. And so then Steiner reiterates his major claims in chapter 9 about the repression of the psychophysical organization when it comes to intuitive activity. So he says, it is particularly significant that the right to call an act of will free arises from the experience that an ideal intuition comes to realization in the act of will. This experience can only be the result of an observation and is so in the sense that we observe our will on a path of development towards the goal where it becomes possible for an act of will to be sustained by purely ideal intuition. This goal can be reached because in ideal intuition, nothing else is at work but its own self-sustaining essence. So think back to the many moments where we've undertaken the concentration exercise, where in the choice to focus on a particular object, we are raising something up into conscious awareness that we are regularly unconscious of or not attentive to, which is the fact that in every act of observation, when we are able to recognize something, attach a concept to the percept, we're also thinking. And so when we do the concentration exercise, we're observing our thinking and we're directing to a percept the same activity that has produced the percept of the thoughts that we're generating through this concentration exercise. And so when Steiner says, this experience can only be the result of an observation and is so in the sense that we observe our will on a path of development towards the goal where it becomes possible for an act of will to be sustained by purely ideal intuition. I hear him speaking about the gradual collapsing between that upwelling movement, that energy, the thinking that produces the thoughts that are later our percepts that we experience in the concentration exercise. The pencil is a cylinder, the pencil is yellow, the pencil the pencil, that gradually in this far off potential to actualize ourselves as always immediately acting on behalf of intuition, the will according fully with intuition, there's this closing of the gap between thinking and willing. This would mean that the free spirit has totally permeated the psychophysical organization. So Steiner says, when I observe an act of will that is an image of intuition, from this act of will too all organically necessary activity has withdrawn. The act of will is free. This freedom of the will cannot be observed by anyone who is unable to see how the free act of will consists in the fact that, firstly, through the intuitive element, the activity that is necessary for the human organism is checked and repressed, and then replaced by the spiritual activity of the idea-filled will. And a little bit later, those who can make this observation win through to the recognition that man is unfree insofar as he cannot complete the process of suppressing the organic activity. Also that this unfreedom tends toward freedom, and that this freedom is by no means an abstract ideal, but is a directive force inherent in human nature. Man is free to the same extent that he is able to realize in his acts of will the same mood of soul that lives in him when he becomes aware of the forming of purely ideal spiritual intuitions, for instance, in the pursuit of knowledge, where we're participating in something higher, in the sense that it transcends our embodied particularity, but also connects it with what is universal. That's my best shot at interpreting this. I'd love to hear if you have a different take or similar take that you feel illuminates things a bit more concretely. And now for chapter 13, the value of life, optimism and pessimism. So already in the title we have the two viewpoints that Steiner will use as the extremes of philosophical positions regarding the value of life. It seems that one of the motivations for writing this chapter for Steiner is his intellectual friendship with the philosopher Edward von Hartmann, who Steiner looked up to and felt disappointed by for the latter's incomprehension of what Steiner was bringing here. But it's an important question to address because it bears on the whole question of world purpose and individual purpose that Steiner already addressed, because the way one comes to an understanding of the value of life will then go on to reflect itself in our conception of what it means to truly actualize ourselves as human beings, or at least be on the way to that never-ending goal. So essentially, optimism would be that view of life which assumes that the cosmos is the best possible cosmos. All is ordained by God, even evil, as that which gives us an appreciation of the good and has no real existence of its own aside from being a shade. Whereas the pessimistic view, who he represents with thinkers like Schopenhauer and von Hartmann, though differently, essentially construes human existence as suffering, and that all striving, all desiring, and the pleasures that are their objects are illusions to the extent that we think they are what makes life worth living, because for these philosophers, what the pursuit of such pleasures really brings is more misery. And these respective views, optimism and pessimism, lead to different interpretations of what human life should be about. So for the optimist, human life should be about cooperating and bringing forth the good, cooperating with God's intentions. There's a very affirmative attitude towards life as it is. But for the pessimists, the vocation of humanity in some sense involves a surrendering of what we think makes us happy for either a universal idleness or apathy, as Steiner describes of Schopenhauer. I haven't personally read Schopenhauer, so I can't speak for him. Or in the case of Edward von Hartmann, who envisions the cosmic process as the gradual overcoming of God's own suffering, that we forego our own desires to somehow participate in bringing about the end of the cosmos and the end of God's suffering. So, as with other forms of metaphysical realism, when it comes to the moral vocation of humanity, and for von Hartmann, the purpose of human life is found beyond human experience, beyond our conscious intentions, to the extent that we have not yet recognized that what we desire is illusory. And Steiner notes that von Hartmann, like himself and other thinkers of that time, of the late 19th century, early 20th century, tried to derive their proofs from experience, or what they claim to be experience. And so he says that Hartmann's view, as Hartmann understood it, issued from an accounting of the facts of experience, which show that there is more suffering than pleasure in life, and that this surplus of pain is the measure for articulating this pessimistic worldview. Steiner spends much of the chapter interrogating this claim. And one of the things he starts out with saying is that striving is not necessarily painful. Desiring is not necessarily painful. In fact, there is a kind of pleasure in striving for a hoped-for desire. And it's only really the lack of fulfillment of what we desired that brings pain, unless it's pain that isn't directly related to our desire, because there's also pain that just befalls us. And Steiner also mentions that there's even a kind of pleasure in recognizing that you've done your best, which I think we all know from experience. So he says, the blissful feeling of having tried one's best is overlooked by those who say of every unsatisfied desire that not only is the joy of fulfillment absent, but the enjoyment of the desiring itself has been destroyed. Steiner then goes on to critique the recognition of supposedly illusory desires detracts from the pleasure that was experienced through their attainment at the moment. Steiner's criticism there is that one is then making something other than feeling, which is what pleasure and pain are connected with, the benchmark for determining the value of life, if the value of life is indeed to be measured against the surplus of pain or pleasure. And as we'll see, Steiner will go on to make distinctions between different kinds of pleasures and different kinds of desires. He'll speak of the potential to be driven by spiritual desires, the aims of which, when achieved, result in a form of pleasure that is good for the human soul. And even if certain desires are discarded and recognized as illusory, Steiner questions, why should the pleasure that we once experienced from them be discarded? And why should these feelings be eliminated? He writes, for whoever has them, they are certainly pleasure-giving. For whoever has conquered them, a purely mental but nonetheless significant pleasure arises through the experience of self-conquest, not through the vain emotion, what a noble fellow I am, but through the objective sources of pleasure which lie in the self-conquest. If we strike out feelings from the pleasure side of the balance on the ground that they are attached to objects which turn out to have been illusory, we make the value of life dependent not on the quality, but on the quality of pleasure, and this in turn on the value of the objects which cause the pleasure. More on this later. And so if we can't demonstrate whether there's a surplus of pain or pleasure through feeling, as those philosophers who base their conclusion as to whether there is value to human life or not do when they make the quantity of either one the benchmark for that conclusion, Steiner thinks that there needs to be another way of... And so in keeping with his method, which involves this rhythm between observation and thinking, Steiner says, well, if the pessimist or the optimist wants to base their characterization of the value of life on feeling, then we're going to have to look for some evidence in experience that points to the balance tipping in favor of pleasure or pain. We're going to have to find a percept and apply our thinking to the percept. And the observation that he points to is the fact that though there is much suffering in life, though often there are not enough resources to go around, the number, as Steiner writes, of those who kill themselves is relatively unimportant, and I think what he means is marginal when compared with the multitude of those who live bravely on. I feel like unimportant is probably not the best translation there. Only very few people, Steiner continues, give up the business of life because of the pain involved. What follows from this? Either that it is untrue to say that the quantity of pain is greater than the quantity of pleasure, or that we do not at all make the continuation of life dependent on the quantity of pleasure or pain that is felt. So interestingly, in keeping to his method, Steiner shows that through this contemplation of a fact of life, that compared with the number of people who go on bravely enduring harsh conditions with those who commit suicide, there's a disproportionate number if we were to assume that the value of life is determined by the balance of pleasure and pain. So there's something else going on. So through observation of actual experience, Steiner arrives at the conclusion that there must be a different way of measuring the value of life, other than the mere balance of pleasure and pain. He goes on to show through a series of examples that the quantity or the value of our pleasure has a proportional relationship with the intensity of our desire, and that we are willing to put up with all kinds of suffering if our desire is intense enough. A simple example is food, both in that we can take pleasure in the enjoyment of fine dining in addition to satiating our organismic need for nourishment. And so if our desire for fine dining is so intense that we would forego cheap fast food and endure a longer bout of hunger than usual just in order to wait for the better quality food, the value in this instance is measured in the relationship between the desire and the pleasure sought for, and the corresponding suffering of being hungry for longer is worth it so long as we don't go hungry for so long that it becomes a matter of indifference what we have to eat. But if the window is short enough, the pleasure that good quality food affords is worth the wait, is worth the pain. But another example, again working with the scenario of hunger, shows this proportional relationship between desire, the intensity of desire, and pleasure. So as Steiner writes, a quantity which is greater produces a surplus which has not been demanded, and which is felt as pleasure only so long as, whilst enjoying the pleasure, we can increase the intensity of our desire. If the increase in our desire is unable to keep pace with the increase in pleasure, then pleasure turns into displeasure. The thing that would otherwise satisfy us now assails us without our wanting it and makes us suffer. This proves that pleasure has value for us only to the extent that we can measure it against our desires. So once you've satiated your hunger, and if you do not have some kind of dysregulated relationship to eating, the desire abates once you have eaten to your heart's content. And so what once gave you hunger and satiating your hunger can actually make you feel terrible if you eat too much. And this brings up an interesting question as to proper objects of our various kinds of desire. We might ask ourselves if we ever suffer from some sort of addiction, whether it's excessive eating or drinking or addiction to falling in love, if we might be displacing spiritual desires the into the domain of desires that are bound up with our organism and so require a limit, whereas certain spiritual desires, maybe to have a connection with the divine that is infinite, may have this quality of limitlessness that is only appropriate for it. And if we displace that into the wrong sphere, something like addiction could arise. That's a side note. Suffice it to say that for Steiner, the magnitude of pleasure is related to the degree of my need. And a little bit further, this is the way that the value of a pleasure is determined in life. It is measured by the needs of life. Our desires are the yardstick. Pleasure is the thing measured. Steiner then goes on to point out that as individuals, what is an object of desire for you may not be an object of desire for me, and that we can only really speak of desire in the concrete, in the specific, and so it doesn't quite make sense to speak of the value of life in terms of these more abstract ideas of pleasure and pain as if they could be measured against each other. Steiner writes, we never aim at a certain quantity of pleasure in the abstract, but at concrete satisfaction in a perfectly definite way. If we are aiming at a pleasure which must be satisfied by a particular object or a particular sensation, we shall not be satisfied with some other object or some other sensation that gives us an equal amount of pleasure. This leads Steiner to conclude that the desire, therefore, does not compare the pain endured directly to the pleasure achieved, but compares it indirectly by relating its own intensity of the desire to that of the pain. The question is not whether the pleasure to be gained is greater than the pain, but whether the desire for the goal is greater than the hindering effect of the pain involved. Steiner thinks he finds evidence for this in other facts of observation, including the very common tendency for us to value something more highly if it requires a lot of striving and challenge and obstacles to get there. When suffering and misery have toned down our desire, and yet after all our goal is reached, then the pleasure in proportion to the amount of desire still left is all the greater. And Steiner thinks he sees this also in the kingdoms beyond the human, where our animal kin struggle through the harshest of conditions just to survive, just to continue on in their own existence. And so even though we might relate to desire and pleasure in different ways than our animal kin, there's still this continuity of enduring the struggle for the sake of the sheer pleasure of existing, to the extent that we can enjoy it at all. Research on the human brain and certain neurotransmitters like dopamine, it used to be thought that dopamine was simply released when we experience some kind of reward, but what this recent research has showed is that it's only when there's reward coupled with continual striving that we maintain healthy levels of dopamine. Whereas, as with smartphones and easy access to indulgent fast food or sweets or alcohol, whatever it might be, these quick rewards without striving actually make us unhealthy mentally and physically. So it is borne out, you could say, in our biology. Someone might ask, why is Steiner so concerned with this? And like I said, Steiner valued the perspective of Edward von Hartmann, who is his main interlocutor in this chapter. And he also valued the philosophy, even though he had critiques of it, of Nietzsche, who I think is strongly represented, though not mentioned in this chapter, to the extent that Steiner has this affirmative attitude towards human desire if human potential is actualized and we have a right orientation to desire, that we have access to the highest desires, the spiritual desires that can orient us in the most dignified way. And he wants to affirm this human dignity by conceiving of the highest form of human purpose and the value of life connected with it as something that arises out of human desire itself, and not something that needs to be imposed upon us from outside, as in Edward von Hartmann's vision, where against what the human desires, there has to be this realization through reason that the real purpose of the universe is the cessation of the gods' suffering, and so against our will, we have to participate in somehow advancing the cosmos and becoming extinct, and so serving the cessation of God's suffering. Instead, Steiner writes, if the pessimist believes that by showing pain to be present in greater quantity than pleasure, they are preparing the ground for unselfish devotion to the work of civilization, they forget that the human will, by its very nature, does not allow itself to be influenced by this knowledge, because we continue to strive even in the midst of pain and suffering, if our desire for the goal that we seek to attain is sufficient enough to keep us going. Human striving is directed towards the measure of satisfaction that is possible after all difficulties are overcome. Hope of such satisfaction is the foundation of all human activity, and as he touched upon earlier, you could say is even the foundation for the survival of all organisms, the value of life. The work of every individual and of the whole of civilization springs from this hope. Pessimistic ethics believes that it must present the pursuit of happiness as an impossibility for man in order that he may devote himself to the proper moral tasks. But these moral tasks are nothing but the concrete and natural spiritual instincts, and man strives to satisfy them in spite of the incidental pain. The pursuit of happiness which the pessimist would eradicate is therefore nowhere to be found, but the tasks which man has to fulfill he does fulfill, because from the very nature of his being he wants to fulfill them, once he has properly recognized their nature. Pessimistic ethics declares that only when a person has given up the quest for pleasure can he devote himself to what he recognizes as his task in life. But no system of ethics can ever invent any life tasks other than the realization of the satisfactions that human desires demand, and the fulfillment of man's moral ideals. No ethics can deprive man of the pleasure he experiences in the fulfillment of his desires. And I'm going to go on at length because I think this is so important. When the pessimist says, "Do not strive for pleasure, for you can never attain it. Strive rather for what you recognize to be your task," we must reply, "But this is just what man does, and the notion that he strives merely for happiness is no more than the invention of an errant philosophy. He aims at the satisfaction of what he himself desires, and he has in view the concrete objects of his striving, not happiness in the abstract, the specific ideals that we as individuals have in life, what guides us. It's different for each of us as individuals, though in accordance with this notion of ethical individualism, we might somehow converge in the realization of a better world. It is for him a pleasure. When pessimistic ethics demands, strive not for pleasure, but for the attainment of what you see as your life's task, it hits on the very thing that man, in his own being, wants. Man does not need to be turned inside out by philosophy. He does not need to discard his human nature before he can be moral. Morality lies in striving for a goal that one recognizes as justified. It is human nature to pursue it as long as the pain incurred does not inhibit the desire for it altogether. This is the essence of all genuine will. Ethical behavior is based not upon the eradication of all striving for pleasure, to the end that bloodless abstract ideas may establish their dominion unopposed by any strong yearnings for the enjoyment of life, but rather upon a strong will, sustained by ideal intuition, a will that reaches its goal even though the path may be thorny. Moral ideals spring from the moral imagination of man. The realization depends on his desire for them being intense enough to overcome pain and misery. They are his intuitions, the driving forces which his spirit harnesses. He wants them because their realization is his highest pleasure. So again, rounding back to the very beginning of the book, Steiner makes a case that consciously motivated human action, motivated according to intuitions that are always contextual, intuitive responses to a given perceptual context, are the means by which human beings, once they've translated it into a moral imagination, a way in which the intuition, love thy neighbor, manifests as keep your surroundings clean, presentable, beautiful, tidy, a particular situation, manifests in the perceptible world around us. Again, this is one example. And this mode of life is something that we can only freely actualize if we recognize it as valuable, if it's something that we want. And so Steiner can say, anyone who would eradicate the pleasure brought by the fulfillment of human desires will first have to make human beings into slaves who would act not because they want to, but only because they must, whether it's dictated by the paternal authority or by the internalization of the paternal authority as what Steiner calls conscience, even though, like I said, you might have a different notion of conscience that is more along the lines of what he calls intuition. Physical nature, Steiner writes, sees to it that the human being strives to satisfy his or her lower desires, but the development of the whole human also includes those desires that originate in the spirit. And a bit further on, moral action consists not in the eradication of a one-sided personal will, so not in the eradication or the total suppression of lower desires, but in the full development of human nature, the holistic development of human nature. Those who hold that moral ideals are attainable only if the individual destroys his own personal will are not aware that these ideals are wanted by that person, just as he wants the satisfaction of the so-called animal instincts. And so when it comes to Waldorf education, One of the most important things that a teacher can do is support the student in awakening to these spiritual desires that are not necessarily given to us in the outset, but need the nourishment of the cultural life, and to support the student in becoming a free spirit who wants to actualize these spiritual desires by not forcing them on them before they've awakened to the value of them themselves. Steiner writes, and I love this: if a person strives for sublimely great ideals, it is because they are the content of his own being, and their realization will bring him a joy compared to which the pleasure that a limited outlook gets from the gratification of commonplace desires is a mere triviality. Idealists revel spiritually in the translation of their ideals into reality. And so you can hear in what Steiner describes how the gratification of the so-called commonplace desires is akin to remaining in our own perception or feeling or preferences, even though it's something that's part of the human condition and that we all share in, but that may potentially, if we overemphasize the gratification of those desires, it may end up insulating us from the world and from other people. I think that's very clear in addiction. Whereas if we live in a more balanced way and really allow ourselves to be guided by higher ideals, their realization can bring us together in shared missions. And there really is a lot of beauty when certain projects come to fruition, or in just simple moments of shared aspiration in the midst of a lot of darkness in the world shine through. Now for chapter 14, Individuality and Genus, a very short chapter. Even though this is a short chapter, it's one of the places in Steiner's whole corpus that is important to consider when issues of racism are discussed with respect to anthroposophy, because in some of his later esoteric lectures and works, Steiner does say things that can be characterized as racialist and are grouped into this larger category of racist ideas. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact of inconsistency in his vision, because in these later esoteric works, he unfortunately perpetuates some racialist theorizing, but it's very clear in this chapter in 1894 already that he also made claims to the opposite effect, saying that, for instance, if we seek in the generic laws the reasons for an expression of an individual, we seek in vain. Even though we all partake of generic categories, we are born into male or female bodies or into some permutation along that continuum of polarity, which still is a genus to the extent that it can be identified, but we're also part of a particular ethnic group, a family, a nation, a historical period. These are all generic categories that we belong to, but our individuality is not reducible to these generic categories. Racialist thinking does reduce people to generic categories. But here Steiner says what is generic in the human being serves only as a medium in which to express his own individuality. So Steiner's conception of individuality is interesting because I think nowadays we often draw upon these generic categories to define what makes us unique, and they do. They are a factor, and they are a factor in how we are to characterize ourselves as unique individuals as the medium. So as we've seen in former chapters, a person's individuality is forged through the way that they uniquely pursue knowledge, individualize concepts through personal experience, through mental images, and also how they enact moral intuitions, actualize their potential as free spirits, how they relate to the universal world of ideas as a unique individual. So as Steiner writes, determining the individual according to the laws of his genus ceases where the sphere of freedom in thinking and acting begins. The conceptual content which man has to connect with the percept by an act of thinking in order to have the full reality cannot be fixed once and for all and bequeathed ready-made to mankind. The individual must get his concepts through intuition. So remember, even though every free action motivated by intuition is responding to a particular context of percepts, a scenario which could be explicitly focused on our situatedness, for instance, how a white person inheriting the whole perceptual history of whiteness in a given context responds to a situation with an awareness of that out of intuition and all the privileges that come with that, there may be this possibility when acting out of intuition to bring something new into the world that is not a perpetuation of the same power dynamics. The same is true for every individual. As Steiner writes, how the individual has to think cannot possibly be deduced from any kind of generic concept. It depends simply and solely on the individual. Just as little is it possible to determine from the general characteristics of man what concrete aims the individual may choose to set himself. If we would understand the single individual, we must find our way into his own particular being and not stop short at those characteristics that are typical. In this sense, every single human being is a separate problem, and every kind of study that deals with abstract thoughts and generic concepts is but a preparation for the knowledge we get when a human individuality tells us his way of viewing the world, and, on the other hand, for the knowledge we get from the content of his acts of will. Whenever we feel that we are dealing with that element in a person which is free from stereotyped thinking and instinctive willing, then, if we would understand him in his essence, we must cease to call to our aid any concepts at all of our own making. This is a very interesting claim. It reminds me of this notion that I learned when I was studying Buddhism, which is a kind of virtue and a practice. I think the word is I'm not sure what language, Pali, I'm not sure what upaya or skillful means, where the spiritual teacher adapts their message for the audience that is listening. And I think that what Steiner's saying is that we always have to adapt our interpretation according to the person that we're listening to, who's drawing on their own unique, situated, self-percept, which, remember, is the inner world that consists of all our particular experiences and how those particular experiences are connected with individualized concepts, and that inform our unique way of communicating a truth or whatever it is that we're sharing with another human being, and that we need to have that sensitivity when someone uses a word that maybe we have a particular association with, but maybe that's not what they mean when they say it, in order to really read between the lines and hear what is being communicated beyond just the words that are being said. Steiner says, we must cease to call to our aid any concepts at all of our own making. The act of knowing consists in combining the concept with the percept by means of thinking. With all other objects, the observer must get his concepts through his intuition, so when we're seeking to know the world. But if we are to understand a free individuality, another human spirit, we must take over into our own spirit those concepts by which he determines himself in their pure form, without mixing our own conceptual content with them. Those who immediately mix their own concepts into every judgment about another person can never arrive at the understanding of an individuality. It obscures our being able to really see the other person. And this is beautiful. This is in addition to the pursuit of knowledge as one way in which we reunite ourselves with the world after the division that's brought about with the emergence of self-consciousness, we can bridge the separation between each other through this ethic of listening. Just as the free individuality emancipates himself from the characteristics of the genus in free, intuitive action, so must the act of knowing emancipate itself from the way in which we understand what is generic. And so we cannot impose generic categories onto other people and still relate to them as a free spirit. When we impose generic categories onto people, we really treat them as objects. No human being is all genus, none is all individuality, but every person gradually emancipates a greater or lesser sphere of his or her being both from the generic characteristics of animal life and from domination by the degrees of human authorities, as regards that part of his nature where a man is not able to achieve this freedom for himself, because it's a mixed bag. There are aspects of our life where we are not free, and I'm grateful that I don't have to be in charge of the involuntary processes of my organism. I'd probably die if I had to be. And to the extent that we're unfree, we constitute a part of the whole organism of nature and spirit. In this respect, he lives by copying others or obeying their commands, but only that part of his conduct that springs from his intuitions can have ethical value in the true sense. So rather than end this lecture series with the appendix, which is the last actual section of the book, I'm going to give the summary of it now prior to the conclusion itself, which I think is a nicer way to wrap things up, given what Steiner says in the conclusion. In the appendix, he's once again picking up the pole of doubt, demonstrating his conscientiousness as a philosopher, and specifically his conscientiousness with respect to the criticisms leveraged at him by someone he admired, Edward von Hartmann. And so in this appendix, he admits that what he's addressing may seem like a remote and unnecessary tissue of abstract concepts to certain people, because in this world of philosophy, certain prejudices that certain thinkers possess reflect their conditioning by the prevailing modes of thought of that time. And so, as Steiner writes, what follows is rather a problem which certain philosophers insist should be discussed as part of the subject matter of such a book as this, because by their whole way of thinking they have created certain difficulties which do not otherwise occur. And the problem that he's addressing here is what we might connect with the notion of solipsism, or this idea that the world that we experience is just within our own consciousness, and that the people in it and all the other things aren't really real, but just creations of our own consciousness. How do we know that that's not true? And if this isn't true, how is it that another person's consciousness can affect mine or communicate with mine? And how do we know that we're both in the same world? And Steiner, at least in the case of Edward von Hartmann, argues that there are certain presuppositions that lead to this problem, which Steiner's philosophy of freedom, his monism, and this processual relationship between thinking and observation doesn't meet as a problem. So remember, von Hartmann's philosophy, Steiner characterizes following von Hartmann as transcendental realism. And this is supposed to be the view that, and for von Hartmann, one arrives at this view after passing through the phase of naive realism, where there's this belief that the world of percept is what's really real and thinking is less real than percepts, not recognizing that thinking is always at work in determining and distinguishing percepts, making them intelligible. And then to the phase of critical or transcendental idealism, where there's this recognition that between the percept of experience, of observation, and my subjectivity, there is a mental picture mediating between them. So there's this recognition that we don't have, at least as it is just given immediately in perception, the full picture of things. And so there's this inference to the things in themselves that are causing the appearance of the objects in my consciousness. And I can't know these things in themselves, but only the mental pictures in my consciousness. And then with von Hartmann, there's a step further, an inference that because we seem to be experiencing the same world, or at least a similar world, that we and all of the objects in themselves, including other human intelligences, other human individuals, are somehow connected unconsciously. And so this issue arises regarding the mediation of you and me, your communication with me. So, as a transcendental realist, von Hartmann does not believe that you are just a construct of my own consciousness, but that if we're both in a room, there are actually 6 of us. So there's 2 of us in the sense that there's 2 versions of us in as objects in themselves, as the really real manifestations of ourselves in the but in the sphere that is unconscious or inaccessible to us. And then there's the 2 mental images of you and me that I have, and the 2 mental images of me and you that you have. So there's 6 of us according to the transcendental realist. But Steiner, in bringing his rhythmic interplay of observation and thinking says, no, actually, there's just two of us. And this follows upon the last chapter when Steiner's describing what happens when we really let another free spirit into our being rather than impose our own concepts onto them. We can commune with another being if we allow their thinking to enter into us. So, as Steiner says, through the thinking with which I confront the other person, the percept of him becomes, as it were, transparent to the mind. I am bound to admit that when I grasp the percept with my thinking of the other person, it is not at all the same thing as appeared to the outer senses. In what is a direct appearance to the senses, something else is indirectly revealed. The mere sense appearance extinguishes itself at the same time as it confronts me, because then it is the revelation of something that we experience in our thinking, or in a thinking that's entering into us. But what it reveals through this extinguishing compels me as a thinking being to extinguish my own thinking as long as I am under its influence and to put its thinking in the place of mine. I then grasp its thinking in my thinking as an experience like my own. So, like when we really listen to another, this could say, circling back to one of the earlier chapters when Steiner is comparing this intuitive thinking and the way in which will and feeling combine in it as something through which love is moving. This receptive orientation, you could say, is a kind of love where we're like bracketing out our own impulse to impose our concepts or say something in response before we've really heard the other person. I then grasp its thinking in my thinking as an experience like my own. I have really perceived another person's thinking. The immediate percept, extinguishing itself as sense appearance, is grasped by my thinking, and this is a process lying wholly within my consciousness and consisting in this, that the other person's thinking takes the place of mine. Through the self-extinction of the sense appearance, the separation between the two spheres of consciousness is actually overcome. This expresses itself in my consciousness through the fact that while experiencing the content of another person's consciousness, I experience my own consciousness as little as I experience it in dreamless sleep, if we're really listening. So much for the problem of how another person's soul life can affect ours. And now for the conclusion. This section title is Ultimate Questions, the Consequences of Monism. And of course, the conclusion includes a lot of summary and some repetition, but is a kind of deepening in that way, and is really the first time that Steiner fully connects his path of thoughtful observation, we could call renewal of participation, to draw on Owen Barfield's terms, with a conception of the divine that is not remote from experience. And so he repeats once more that the single human individual is not actually cut off from the universe. He is part of it, and between this part and the totality of the cosmos, there exists a real connection which is broken only for our perception. And so, as beings that are both embodied perceivers and beings that can participate in thinking, it is the perceiving part of us, the limited part of us, because we enter into a body, into a particular historical context, and this creates the appearance of separation and an actual experience of it until it's overcome through thinking, through knowledge. So once the multiplicity of percepts is woven, Steiner writes, by our thinking into the network of the conceptual world, we start to overcome this. As soon as this happens, he writes, all separate existence turns out to be mere illusion due to perceiving. Thinking destroys the illusion due to perceiving and integrates our individual existence into the life of the cosmos. The unity of the conceptual world, which contains all objective percepts, also embraces the content of our subjective personality. Thinking gives us reality in its true form as a self-contained unity, whereas the multiplicity of percepts is but a semblance due to the way we are organized. So this living, active participation in thinking is almost a kind of remembrance of the unity of the world, and that what we experience as separate concepts are really bits and pieces splintered off from the currents of flowing meaning that is bound up with life, cosmic life, and the possibility of experiencing ourselves as individual beings a part of it. And so if we remember that it's only due to our organization that concepts could ever appear abstract, but when united with percepts in a dynamic way, just reflect the fact that the cosmos is this visceral reality, but also one that is intelligent and full of meaning. So Steiner writes, only as long as we think of the law and order that permeates and determines the percept as having the abstract form of a concept are we in fact dealing with something purely subjective. But the content of a concept which is added to the percept by means of thinking is not subjective. This content is not taken from the subject, but from reality. It is that part of the reality that cannot be reached by the act of perceiving. It is experience, but not experience gained through perceiving. If someone cannot see that the concept is something real, he is thinking of it only in the abstract form in which he holds it in his mind, but only through our organization is it present in such isolation. An abstract concept taken by itself has as little reality as a percept taken by itself. The percept is the part of reality that is given objectively. Reality is not contained in the abstract concept. It is, however, contained in thoughtful observation, which does not one-sidedly consider either a concept or percept alone, but rather the union of the two. So it's this constant dance. If we want our concepts to be reflective of the real and to mean something, to have existential value for us, we have to have a fidelity to the world that is given in perception. So Steiner uses this phrase that gets at the reunifying of concept and percept. He says thoughtful observation. And remember, thinking is that element that is always at work in our perception to the extent that we can recognize anything. So it's always there, but we're usually fixed. Our attention is usually focused on the object of perception, not the fact that our thinking is also at work in it. But if we can become conscious of that, there's an increased possibility that we will achieve a more intuitive relationship with everyday existence. So he says, when we observe with our thinking, we carry out a process which itself belongs to the order of real events. By means of thinking within the experience itself, we overcome the one-sidedness of mere perceiving. We cannot argue out the essence of reality by means of abstract conceptual hypotheses, which in class I've referred to as shuffling around ideas abstracted from mental images from experience in our minds, kind of like a computer. We cannot argue out the essence of reality by means of abstract conceptual hypotheses through pure conceptual reflection, but insofar as we find the ideas that belong to the percepts, we are living in the reality. Monism does not seek to add to experience something non-experienceable, but finds the full reality in concept and percept. This is why I think Barfield's, as I've mentioned before in class, Barfield's notion or use of the word participation, which Steiner also uses in certain places, one of them being this cycle or book titled The Redemption of Thinking, where he's talking about the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Participation is a helpful word for English speakers, at least, because thinking can sometimes, well, thinking carries this connotation of the dead intellect shuffling around abstract ideas that it's extracted from experience, rather than this attentive and actively connecting orientation to what is given to us in perception. So think about Goethe's scientific method and just the way in which one has to keep their mind awake and attuned to what is being observed so that we can draw connections between the different observations and build a bigger picture of the given phenomenon that we're seeking to know. Steiner then goes on to repeat this idea that for monism, the conceptual content of the world is the same for all human individuals. And he's just saying here, and he'll qualify this if it sounds a bit too universalist, it's a qualified universalism in the sense that he recognizes our situatedness in our individual interfacing with the universal world of ideas. But essentially what he's saying here is that the concept of a lion that you have is the same concept of the lion that I have, to the extent that there's only one concept of lion in the universal world of ideas, even though through our individual experiences going through life, seeing pictures of lions when we're kids, we have gone through a different process of individualizing the concept and have a unique mental picture of it based on all those experiences. Nonetheless, it is those mental pictures mediate something that is one, and in discussing it can bring us together in thinking it. So as Steiner says, thinking leads all perceiving subjects to the same ideal unity in all multiplicity. The unitary world of ideas expresses itself in them as in a multiplicity of individuals. As long as a person apprehends himself merely by means of self-perception, he sees himself as this particular individual. As soon as he looks at the world of ideas that lights up within him, embracing all that is separate, he sees within himself the absolute reality, living and shining forth. And this is where the pre-modern notion of the ontic logos reappears, even though Steiner doesn't name it as such. But that principle of intelligibility that pervades the cosmos and is connected with this unitary world of ideas, that which we participate in through our efforts to think. Dualism defines the primordial being as that which pervades and lives in all men. Monism finds this divine life common to all in reality itself. The ideas of another human being are in substance mine also, and I regard them as different only as long as I perceive, but no longer when I think. Every person embraces in his thinking only a part of the total world of ideas, and to that extent individuals differ even in the actual content of their thinking. But these contents are within a self-contained whole, which embraces the thought contents of all people. Hence, every person in his thinking lays hold of the universal primordial being which pervades all. To live in reality filled with the content of thought is at the same time to live in God. So this is beautiful, I think, and I did touch upon it in a former chapter when it seemed as if Steiner, in rejecting a notion of divinity that can only be inferred but not experienced, it seemed as if Steiner might have been rejecting the notion of divinity at all. But what we see here is that through this intentional orientation to life, through knowledge of the world, through intuitive action, which is a kind of reunion of knowing and doing, thinking and willing, we're also verging on a more wakeful relationship with the divine pervading the world, to the extent that the mind of God is this unitary world of ideas that we are participating in. So as Steiner writes, the human being does not take the purposes of an objective, transcendental, primordial being and make them his own, but he pursues his own individual purposes given him by his moral imagination. And I just want to, as I have before, make a little comment here about the word transcendental. It's meant in a more philosophically technical way than the word transcendence, than what we might take the word transcendence to mean. So transcendence itself can refer to a divinity that pervades the world but is nonetheless infinite and cannot be encompassed by any kind of analogy with the finite, even though we might use certain symbols modeled on finite experience to get at different aspects of the infinite divinity. And so this does seem actually to characterize Steiner's divinity to the extent that he thinks any attempts to model a notion of the divinity on, for example, finite human personality is an error. But when he uses the word transcendental here, he's specifically, this is sort of echoing from Kant's philosophy and this idea that there are objects in themselves transcendental to the mental images that I have of them. And so it's referring to this particular philosophy connected with Edward von Hartmann as well, rather than a dismissal of the notion of transcendence in general. This is just an aside. The idea, as Steiner continues, that realizes itself in an action he detaches from the unitary world of ideas and makes it the basis of his will. Therefore, it is not the commandments injected into this world from the beyond that live in his action, but human intuitions belonging to this world itself. Monism knows no such world dictator who sets our aims and directs our actions from outside. And beware of anyone who claims to know such a dictator. And then Steiner, at the end of the section before the author's additions, he acknowledges that there's something paradoxical about the way in which a given moment might call us as individuals to a very specific intuition to an act that we nonetheless freely choose, but almost has some kind of character of necessity about it. So as he says, it is true that this impulse is determined ideally in the unitary world of ideas, but in practice it is only by man that it can be taken from that world and translated into reality. The grounds for the actual translation of an idea into reality by man, monism can find only in man himself. Through moral imagination we have to funnel the intuition into the perceptible context and figure out how to make it fit. Before an idea can become an action, man must first want it. Such an act of will therefore has its grounds only in man himself. Man is then the ultimate determinant of his action. He or she is free. And so what I hear Steiner saying here is that the fullest human development will lead free spirits not to act out of their freedom in arbitrary ways, but that they will meet situations where there is an obviously, through intuition, right response called for, and that it's not something that's just good for the individual themselves, but also reflects their truest nature as a being that is actually part of the universal process and now is becoming wakefully related to it once again, overcoming that division. And so whatever the case might be, whatever the situation is, if we understand ourselves rightly, would want that outcome to come about. And now finally, I'll end with what he says in the 1918 author's additions to this, because it leads, you could say, into the world of anthroposophy to the extent that he makes these explicit connections between what he's referring to as the observation of intuitive thinking and the opening out onto the horizon of the spiritual world that has always been nigh. So as Steiner writes, this book presents intuitive thinking as man's inwardly experienced spiritual activity. To understand this nature of thinking by experiencing it amounts to a knowledge of the freedom of intuitive thinking. So we have this capacity not only to exclusively direct our attention to the percepts of our experience, unconsciously contributing thought, but also to become conscious of the fact, to enter into that exceptional state, we have this possibility and become conscious of the fact that we are contributing thinking, and in this space that we've consciously intended to awaken to, intuitions might flow in. And this is also the only proof that we can give ourselves for the reality of freedom. This inner temple of lucidity, a muscle that we're working when we do the concentration exercise, which may, if you practice it consistently, start to work back on your everyday life such that you become conscious of your thinking when you go about your day. Thus, thinking, as Steiner continues on page 216, is characterized as that factor through which man works his way spiritually into reality. And actually, no one should confuse this world conception that is based on the direct experience of thinking with mere rationalism, with the mere logical analysis of past thoughts, or with a logical analysis of present observations. On the other hand, it should be evident from the whole spirit of this argument that for human knowledge the perceptual element only becomes a guarantee of reality when it is taken hold of in thinking, because thinking is what allows us to make our percepts intelligible and draw connections between them, to make distinctions, to explain them by means of connections with each other. Cause and effect is one expression of this. Outside thinking, there is nothing to characterize reality for what it is. Hence, we must not imagine that the kind of reality guaranteed by sense perception is the only one. Whatever comes to us by way of percept is something that, on our journey through life, we simply have to await. It's the given, it's what comes to us. The only question is, would it be right to expect, from the point of view that this purely intuitively experienced thinking gives us, that man could perceive spiritual things as well as those perceived with the senses? It would be right to expect this. For although, on the one hand, intuitively experienced thinking is an active process taking place in the human spirit, on the other hand, it is also a spiritual percept grasped without a physical sense organ. So, when we intend in the concentration exercise to think thoughts about the pencil or the pen that we've just observed, we close our eyes. There's the intending activity through which, and it may be a repetition of thoughts we've already had about the pencil, but something is happening with that intentional activity. And then out of it, out of this kind of geyser, this wellspring of activity, We observe the percepts of thoughts. The pencil is a cylinder. The pen is white. The pen has the color blue on it. The pen is a writing utensil. We could say these are spiritual percepts. We're perceiving them even though initially they required the stimulus of the percept of the pen to produce, which is itself a multiplicity of percepts, as I was just unfolding. But once the concepts have been internalized through the mental image, through such exercises as these, we can become conscious of the possibility of having spiritual percepts as well, working with these thoughts. It is a percept in which the perceiver is himself active, and a self-activity which is at the same time perceived, thinking about thinking, observing thinking at the same time that it's being generated, this self-sustaining activity that Steiner makes the starting point for our adventures in knowing the world. In intuitively experienced thinking, man is carried into a spiritual world also as perceiver, because in observing thoughts through thinking, we're also perceiving at the same time that we're creating. Within this spiritual world, whatever confronts him as a percept in the same way that the spiritual world of his own thinking does, will be recognized by him as a world of spiritual perception. This world of spiritual perception could be seen as having the same relationship to thinking that the world of sense perception has on the side of the senses. Once experienced, the world of spiritual perception cannot appear to man as something foreign to him, because in his intuitive thinking he already has an experience that is purely spiritual in character. Such a world of spiritual perception is discussed in a number of writings which I have published since this book first appeared. The philosophy of freedom forms the philosophical foundation for these later writings, for it tries to show that the experience of thinking, when rightly understood, is, in fact, an experience of spirit. Therefore, it appears to the author that no one who can in all seriousness adopt the point of view of the philosophy of freedom will stop short before entering the world of spiritual perception, because we're already there when we're thinking about thinking, or attempting to cultivate an intuitive relationship with life. It is certainly not possible to deduce what is described in the author's later books by logical inference from the contents of this one. But a living comprehension of what is meant in this book by intuitive thinking will lead quite naturally to a living entry into the world of spiritual perception. And that is really what Steiner hoped anyone inspired by his works would do, is foremost cultivate this capacity for intuitive thinking, which he claims is the essential research method for knowing higher worlds. And this is important because, as he also says here, what he says in his later works cannot be logically inferred from the contents of this one, because according to him, allegedly, what he reports issues from not just the abstract shuffling around of thoughts, but from an active participation in this world of spiritual percepts, in something that comes to one, just as the world of the senses comes to us. And so rather than just believing what Steiner said, one might, if inspired by his works, whether it's this one or future ones, take up his challenge to cultivate this intuitive thinking and become a co-researcher in worlds of soul and spirit. So thanks so much for joining me on this journey. It's been a pleasure to facilitate this course with the students in the Bay Area Waldorf teacher training. And I hope this video series is one that you can return to and continue to deepen. And I invite as well any feedback or criticisms of my construals of different facets of the book. I'm sure there are places where my interpretations may be off. Who knows? But I'd love to be in dialogue. So please do share your thoughts. And I hope for those watching this that are not in the training that this has been valuable, and would love to hear your thoughts as well. Thank you so much. Many blessings. Bye for now.